Greetings, welcome to another episode of Rail Riding Time. This time the train of time has gone international. We've gone to the Crimean region of the Ukraine and we're going to look at a railway that was set up in order to take material and goods and soldiers back and forth from the front lines on the siege of Sevastopol. So make sure that you mind the gap as you leave the train, make sure those doors are slammed shut, and let's have a look at the Grand Central Crimean Railway. Prior to this, European nations had used the railways to move troops around. When the railways first came to Belgium, they insisted that the government was in charge of how the trucks were laid out. That way it could be used effectively for moving troops around should it be needed to. And one notable example is 1846, when the Prussians used the railways to move 14,500 men over to Krakow to quell a rebellion there. Took them 2 days to move the 200 miles. But up until the Crimean War, this is as far as it had gone. Just to move troops up and close to staging area so they were nice and rested and ready for combat. This would change during the Crimean War. In 1853, in order to gain control of the Black Sea from what they saw as a dying Ottoman Empire, the Russians attacked the Ottomans. This didn't have quite the effect it wanted to. They thought it would be a quick victory. However, it wasn't. But it also meant that the two other superpowers in Europe at the time, Great Britain and France, would join in the support of the Ottomans. They had other reasons for joining in as well as the attack, but that's something you can discover later. However, it is a good opportunity to have a look at what happened beforehand in order to see the importance of this new railway. 28th of March 1854 saw Britain and France declare war on Russia and support the Ottomans. It was decided by Lord Raglan, the then commander of the British forces in the area, that the best way to deal with the situation in the area would be an attack on Sevastopol. However, a quick victory in Alma was not capitalised on properly. This meant that the siege lay on for longer than expected. The quick, lightning summer victory turned into a long, harsh winter siege. In these conditions, in fact in any conditions, especially a long protracted siege, one thing is crucial in order to keep soldiers fighting effectively: logistics. Getting food, ammunition, other material up to the front lines in order to keep them fighting. But not only that, getting soldiers back from the front line to let them have a rest, wounded off the front line, so they can get rest and recuperated. It's crucial. The saying, an army marches on its stomach, is very true. I can tell you from experience that if an army isn't getting the right supplies at the right times, it can seriously affect morale of troops. This is the problem that was starting to face the English and French army in the siege of Sevastopol at the time. The Allies did set up a supply base in the harbour of Balaclava, but the road leading from Balaclava all the way up to Sevastopol was a single muddy track. The wet summer, wet autumn killed the roads. It turned it into an absolute quagmire. This was then exacerbated by the freezing winter, which then turned it into a totally impassable system. Captain Henry Clifford, who was stationed at Balaclava, sums it up rather well. He states, "The cold, want of food and the harsh conditions have killed our horses and ponies, and the roads are impassable." He also states that the ammunition for the bombardment is running low due to the fact that the artillery horses are dying 3 and 4 per night. Things were made worse by people like William Russell. William Russell has the claim to be the world's first war reporter. He reported to the Times, "There is no food, no water, no medicine, no commissariats, and no plan. The only thing in abundance here is cholera." To be fair to the British Army, it wasn't actually any worse than it had happened before to them. Napoleonic Wars were a good example of this, and previous to this, the situation was the same. There was only one thing that was different about this war that made it seem a lot worse. People like our friend William Russell, journalists. This was the first war, thanks to the new technologies like telegraph, that was being reported to the public. All this, which would have been hidden before, is now being read by people at their breakfast table. Some of this caused disgust, as you can imagine. Others thought, I need to help. One exemplary example of this is Florence Nightingale. You've probably heard of her. She went over and she set up hospitals and brought nurses over to care for the sick and wounded. It might be an idea to check her out on another site somewhere. There'll be plenty about her, but here we're concentrating on the railways. Back in Britain, things were just calming down after the first railway building boom. For the 25 years approximately since the Liverpool to Manchester line had been built, nearly 6,000 miles of tracks had been laid in Britain. Britain had started to show the country, the continent, nay the world, what could be done with railways, and people were catching on. In fact, three of the contractors that had built many of the miles of railway in Britain at the time, Samuel Peto, Edward Betts and Thomas Brassey, went to the British government and offered, at cost to them, with no gain whatsoever, to build them a railway in order to transport goods from Balaclava up to the front lines. At first, as you can imagine, the War Office were not keen on this interference by civilians. They believed that all they needed to do was improve the roads. However, once they learned that the roads were not going to be made any better, and there was a severe lack of animals out there in order to pull the wagons along the roads, and there was the fact that Samuel Peto himself had stated that he would get the railway running within 3 weeks of landing, they finally agreed to it. The contractors then set to work finding and acquiring the materials needed, the navvies to build it, and other specialist trades that would be needed for this venture. Eventually they got together the 500 men needed and the 5,491 tons that would be required to complete this task. They put them together and spread them across 7 ships, 5 steamships, 2 sailing ships. The idea being that if 2 ships were lost, then they would still be able to complete their task. They set sail on the 21st of December 1854 and landed around the beginning of February 1855. James Beattie was appointed engineer for this project. He was sent out early in order to survey a route so that when the ships landed it was ready to go. The plan being that as soon as the ships landed they'd set up a wharf ready so they could offload the materials, and then the building would start. The railway, to start off with, would follow the old track that was being used. They were trying their best to make sure that their inclines weren't too much. For the motive power they were going to use for the railway to start off with was horse. A stationary engine had been brought for the slope leading up to Sevastopol itself, but the main motive power, as was said, would be horses. The navvies started their hard work as soon as they could, and by April of that year they'd managed to build 7 miles of double track all the way up to the British lines just outside of Sevastopol. This meant that the army could start using it immediately so they could start bringing up supplies to the camp and start bringing back sick and wounded. A surgeon based with the forces at the time, Frederick Robinson, commented, "I walked to the railway, now advanced a short distance from our camp this afternoon, it being constructed on an inclined plane, intervening for a short distance of a mile before the heights in front of Sevastopol. The course of the line being very serpentine, every elevation being avoided as much as possible." On the 2nd of April, the railway was used to carry sick and wounded from Sevastopol down to Balaclava. Could this be the first time that a railway was used in an ambulance train? Also, the fact that it needed to be rushed to be built, and as was mentioned before, the harsh weather played its part on the railway as well. Sometimes the stones sank into the mud, so the railway had to be remended many times. Also, tragically, it had its share of accidents. One such example was 1855, when a crew of the 71st Highlanders were moving back to Balaclava from Sevastopol. The brakes were faulty or something like that, and during a run down the incline it failed to stop in time and they were thrown from the carts when they tried to brake. Again, Frederick Robinson commented on the situation. He stated, 3 men are said to have been killed in this incident and 7 wounded. However, the Times took a very different view of the situation. They stated in their newspaper, many men were pitched from the wagon and were severely injured. 1 man was killed on the spot and many others were having to undergo surgical procedures. In all, the railway proved to be a valuable asset to the forces laying siege to Sevastopol. No, it probably wasn't the best run railway there ever was, changing from one form to another and back to another. Horsepower being used to move from Balaclava up to the slopes of Sevastopol. This was changed in November 1855 when steam locomotives were introduced, but they didn't really have any big impact on it. Then the wagons would then be hitched up to a stationary engine which would drag it up the slope to Sevastopol, and then finally horses to the front. But as I stated before, it was effective and allowed the British forces to push forward with their siege on Sevastopol. The railway also had other effects on the local area. The small village of Kadokoi became a small town thanks to the railway passing by it. The railway workers used to frequent there quite regularly, so it became a place to get supplies, even boasting its own restaurant. And Balaclava itself benefited. The railway lines on the wharf were allowed to be connected to other railway lines coming in, and the fact that it was known so well in the British newspapers brought tourism to it as well, taking it from the small fishing village that it was to the large important port that it is now. The Grand Central Crimean Railway is yet another example of how a small railway can have such a big impact on the world. Yes, it was a small railway, it was pretty badly run. In the end it only totaled 15 miles including sidings, but it changed how railways were used during the wars. No longer was it a case of let's just use the railway to bring the troops up to a certain area and then they can march in. Doctrine changed for many European countries. Britain brought railways under the remit of the Royal Engineers, and by World War I it was fully established that the Royal Engineers would use railways to build light railways up to the trenches to allow supplies to keep running. Railways were a big part of the Chiffon Plan, the plan that moved troops into the Low Countries and towards France at the very beginning of World War I. I hope you enjoyed this look at another railway that was the first and out of the ordinary. There are many like this, and as the episodes go by we shall explore more and more. Until the next time, may the tracks take you on a voyage of discovery into this interesting and sometimes surprising area of history.